Well, the point about it, I'm going to start, actually, I found this from this book, I found this amazing discussion, what she actually said about herself, which I want to read to you. This is what she said. I do not know if the truth that I have told will benefit the world in any way. I managed to do it at great cost to myself and perhaps to others. It's hard to go against the tide of one's time, year and position, but at least I tried to reflect innocently the 20th century and my feelings and perception as a girl and a woman. That's what she said just before she died. And I thought that was very well worth quoting, because it really does describe, she ends up, she's a complete humanist. And this, what she wants to do always, she just wants to show, she talks about art, her art, as history painting. And we know history painting went very down the most, but she feels that her pictures really described what it was like to be a woman in the beginning, in the 20th century. She was born in 1900, you see, so in a way it's easy to talk about her time because she literally is the same age as the century. And she comes from a little town in just outside Philadelphia, and she comes from a middle class, lower middle class family, really, but middle class. Her father is a clerk. He earns enough, but not a lot. Her mother has ideas about her, above her station. She, in her background, one of her ancestors was signed the independence, American independence, so she feels herself to be slightly upper class. It's very, very, very bourgeois. Let's have the first two. Now, these are lovely. These photographs are lovely. She started off, when she left school, she was very clever with mathematics. And she actually went to work to help the family money out. She went to a secretarial college. And so it was very useful for her. She actually typed her son's essays when they went to university. She managed to help her up to make money all of her life, but she did go to begin with. And it wasn't until 1921, when she was 21 years old, that she saved enough money. She always wanted to do art, always wanted to be an artist. And the family thought it was ridiculous. And when she was 21, she managed to make enough money so that she was able to go to the women's, it was a female school in Philadelphia, fine arts school. And she actually did manage, she was very successful there. She worked incredibly hard, and she won all the prizes for it. But what we're looking at the top is her first mad love affair. At the bottom, you see how pretty she was. She was 29 when this picture was taken, actually, this one. But at the top, she was actually 26 or 27, because she went in 1920, no, 24, she was, I said, no, it was 20, she was 24. She went to a summer school and she met this Cuban, Carlos Enriquez. Now, he comes from a very, very wealthy Cuban family. And his family didn't want him to be an artist, but in fact, he was very serious about art. I gather, I didn't look it up, but I gather that he is still, he's considered one of the most important Cuban artists, but I didn't look up his work, so I don't know. But his name was Carlos Enriquez, so if you want to. He was born in 1900, he died before her. He died in 1957. Now, they met in the summer school, and the next year, 1925, they marry, and they go to Havana, where his family are absolutely appalled by her, because she was, by Cuban standards, the Cuban women were still living very much in the sort of Victorian age, and they were sort of, they were expected to marry well, but they certainly had family, had servants for their children, etc. And this extremely independent woman was not a success at all. And so they didn't stay there very long. They came back in 1926 to America, and they stayed with her family. Now the top one there is her in America. She has her first child, and she's called Santillana, and she's a little girl. And the picture on the right is her painting of her husband, who was very, very attractive, very dark, very attractive man. And when they were in Havana for a while, they lived with a family, of course, to begin with, and then they had a flat. They were very wealthy. His father was a very successful businessman, but he never really earned any money. He was being kept by the family, and they moved to a flat. And for a while, they were both working, both painting, and they exhibited there, and they were part of what there was a sort of an art center in Cuba. Okay, but anyway, this is the most terrible thing happened to her. When she came to England, to America, her daughter died of diphtheria. And she was completely devastated by this. The daughter, it was simply terrible, this particular one. And she died in she wasn't a year old when she died. And she was so disturbed by this that she had a bit of a nervous breakdown. Carlos went back to Havana to start with, and then he decided he wanted to be a serious artist. So he took himself off to Paris, the idea being that he would send for her. Before he left, she became pregnant again. But this picture here, which he was very proud of, it's called The Futility of Effort, and it's 1930, and it's about the death of her baby. She read in the newspaper that a child had died in a cot, and this is, she really talking about the death of her only child here, and it's plain gray, and she was really very, very proud of it. Now, when he finally went, he went off she had another little girl, and he went to he first went to Havana, and then he went to Paris. But he took the child with him, for his sisters to look after. She had a complete nervous breakdown, much worse than that. She came out of hospital, and then she really did try to commit suicide, and she tried several times. And the top right at the top there is her drawing of what it was like in the mental home. To begin with, she was put into the normal mental home, and then finally, she really was, as I say, committing suicide. And so they put her into a part of the hospital which was for suicides, and she got really much, much worse. And so finally, the family put her into a sort of a home which was slightly, but they had to pay, which was a lot of money at the time, $40 a week for it. But there, thank God, she had a very good doctor who suggested that she should draw again, because all the time she was ill, she wasn't working at all. And the top pick, the one at the top here, is her experience at that time. And but the one underneath was the one that she took. She's talking about again the death of her child. It's called Symbols, and it's the doll and the apple, and it's 1933. This one here, and The Futility of Effort is 1930. And she really at this time, you see, she's out of hospital, and she's of course living at home again. And this is what we're going to look at now. But she's in 1932, when she comes out of hospital, she had a very good friend, a Russian girl, whose husband is Norwegian, and he was a sailor. And through this husband, she meets the first of her really dreadful the men in her life, and he's called Kenneth Doolittle. And the top picture there is she and Kenneth Doolittle in 1932. And underneath there is this watercolor drawing of him here, which was about probably 1932. Now the center one is this rather strange painting of him. He was a very dressy man, it appears, and this particular one was painted in 1931. Now they move to the village, really, Greenwich Village, and they live at 37 West 17th Street in Greenwich Village, but they have really a very, very tiny flat. And the picture on the right is very funny because a lot of her work is very sardonic. She's having a great laugh at things, and that one actually is very funny, and because it's called Bathing in a Furnished Room, and it's 1931, and you can see half the things out: bathing, having sex, goodness knows what, all in the one room. And this is the reflection of her extremely uncomfortable life at this point. Okay, now this is very, very interesting one. This is they lived in this place called Cornelia Street, and this is 1935 here. And we're looking out of the window onto the street in the village. And it's terribly interesting because you could see how close the houses are to each other. You can see from across the road here. We're looking out from the window and down into the opening here. And this particular picture is very important because in the village at this particular time, we're talking about the early 30s, it was where all the kind of intellectual young people of America went, and particularly poets, writers, everybody was really involved. This particular man is no longer, we don't know his work, but he was in fact a poet, and he's called Keith Farring, and he was born in 1902 and he died in 1965. He was a leading poet, and he very, very left wing. His poetry was published in a magazine called The New Masses. Now, I want you to look at this moderately carefully because it describes the kind of world that she is in fact living in, because he's sitting in behind him are references to his poetry, but more importantly, they're references to the people that they all knew in the village, and you can see them here and here. And there's a very funny bit here where his heart is supposed to be. It's a skeleton with a dripping blood, because he's really talking. It's really talking about his inability to get published and all the rest of it. It's a very interesting picture, this one, and this particular one is 1935. By 1934, the Workers' Progress Administration is put, this by 1934, the WPA, Roosevelt has come into power, and he's realized that he'd had to do something, and he paid. It was quite difficult. You had to be accepted to be on the painting. There was various ones. They were sort of murals, and there were poetry people, and they were writing. They kept the intellectual world alive, really, because we're talking about the 1929 was the beginning of the Great Depression, and everybody was out of work, and there were literally people were being evicted from their houses, and life was very, very, very difficult. So this being a member in the painting school really saved her life, but it was hard. You had to produce a picture every 6 weeks. That's quite a lot. That's a bit difficult, and the pictures had to be relevant to to be accepted, because they knew otherwise you get kicked off. And of course, that was very, very difficult. This happened to her several times, actually. But she was most important. And she literally was one of the earliest people to be a member of the WPA, and she was there right to the end. And it finally finished in 1943. Now, this was terribly important for all the artists, actually all of them. You're talking about de Kooning, Rothko, Barnett Newman, all of them, everybody that we now know as the American important painters of the time were members of the WPA. It was enormously important. Now, this particular picture is the beginning of one of her really, really, really politically and pictures about anxiety, because this painting is called The Great Society and is a reference to the Depression. Now here you see, this is a detail of this. These are the people. Now, if you look at the way the faces are, they're not faces, they're skulls. And she really is describing really the horror of the situation. I mean, quite literally, people literally dying of hunger in the streets. It was quite dreadful. And she was still at this point living in the village, the Greenwich Village area. But she had, at the time, she had something like, it was about sort of, to begin with, about $50 a month, and it eventually went up to sort of $90 a month with the WPA, which was enormously important, really. Okay, let's have the next one. Now, these are the group of intellects that she was surrounded with, and they were all members of the Communist Party. They were very, very, this particular picture on the left is quite marvelous. This one here, he's called Pat Whalen, and it's 1935. And he was the head of the union organizer for the longshoremen. And you see here, he's got the picture, there's a newspaper from the New Masses, the Daily Worker on his side. Look at his hands. It's a very, very important picture. The one on the right, he was a left-wing poet. That's all we know about him. We don't really know a lot about him. There's not much influence about him. He was called Ed Messent, and this was 35 and this was 33. Notice that, look at, she always makes a tremendous point of the hands. It appears that she was very interesting in that she refused to accept that she was interested in contemporary artists. I mean, she always said that she didn't look at other art. Of course, this is not true, but she did. She was very, very, she was perfectly well trained, and she was very interested in art history. And her particular interest at this time was El Greco and Goya. And you can see the Spanish, and you can see it with the use of the hands. It's always interesting. Okay, next one you can see. Now this man, this I think is an extraordinary. I'm very pleased with these two. He's called Max White, and he was a novelist, and his novel was Tiger, Tiger, and his second one was In the Blazing Light, and it again. It was very, very left wing, and it was in fact eventually made into a play. And this particular one, this is 1935, and they remained friends for the whole of their life. And on the right, it's the same man in 1961, absolutely riddled with arthritis. She says, "Can you see his hands? They're completely turned around. Look at the head." Isn't that interesting? You see 35, and this is 30 years longer. Look how her paintings changed. Well, this is why it's interesting. Now, this one is very, very funny. This was the most shocking picture. This particular man is called Joe Gould, and this is 1933. He was sort of an eccentric of the village, and he was a sort of poet, and he was always writing something called the oral history, and he never finished it. he thought himself to be enormously sexually attractive. He wasn't, of course. And he thought that all women wanted to go to bed with him. And so this is basically, she's sending it up really. And there he is with lots and lots and lots of his penises. 1, 2, 3. I think there are something like 4 penises in it. And it says Joe Gould, 1933. It was never really shown because it was considered too rude. But finally, it was in fact shown. But it's the sort of thing when I said half the time, you have to realize that she's very sardonic. She's a very, very witty woman. The one on the right is much smaller. It's called Cityscape. Thank you, dear. It's called Cityscape, and this is 1933, the same year. And you see the kind of work, you see the detail. This is the sort of thing that she would submit to the WPA for to get her keep her money going. Not, of course, not Joe Gould. Okay, next one. This is terribly interesting. And I've managed to find the work of Berenice Abbott, this amazingly interesting photographer. She was born in 1898 and she died in 1991. She was one of the really, really great street photographers. She came to Paris and she was tremendously involved with that game. But this is her picture of the Bowery, and this is the same place that this is. This is 9th Avenue L, 1935, on this side, and this is Berenice Abbott, the Bowery of 1936, the L, and 2nd and 3rd Avenue, and this is the photograph, and it's interesting because you could see the shops. It was still a relatively, you must remember in the early 30s, it was not the New York we know today. There was still sort of quite low houses. The great skyscrapers had not been put up yet. It was very much like sort of London and so on at that time. And very interesting. This is such fun. And it's again Abbott, this particular one. And this is called Apple Blossom Restaurant, and it's 1935. And here on the right, it's West 17th Street, 1935, both in the Bowery. And look, you see, you're underneath the railway, and this is very, very close. This is round the corner to where she actually lived. But I think this one is very interesting. When you look at the particular photograph and you see the price of a fresh roast for 10 cents, I think.
That's dinner.
The dinners you see all around here. Meatballs, shaved for 10 cents. This is what it was like. Of course, absolutely terribly, terribly poor, most of these people. Okay, let's put the other one. But this, I think, is very interesting. This is the longshoremen returning from work in 1936. And remember, I'd already shown you the picture of the man who was the head of their union. And you see them all coming home from work. And it's the same as we saw at the end. There's the elevated train at the top, apartment to let here, and the people coming back from work. And with it, I've put, of course, the wonderful Edward Hopper, who was a contemporary. And this is early Sunday morning. This is 1930. It was actually before this, but I wanted to show you the difference between the two ways of looking at New York City. Hopper's, you don't get any sense really of the poverty that was definitely apparent. If you look at this very carefully, you can see the children running around the streets. This is really what she was talking about. She was talking about the life that she was living, in fact. Okay, next one. Now, terrible thing happened. This Doolittle man was tremendously jealous. He was jealous of the time she spent on her painting, and she was a bit of a flirt. And she'd met this John Rothschild. She'd met him. There was at this particular moment, they had for the first time they had an open exhibition in in Greenwich Village, in the square in Greenwich Village, and this is where they met. And he was in love with her. There was no doubt, but she really wasn't very interested in him. But she went to bed with him from time to time, so more or less to keep him going. He was incredibly kind to her. He saved her life in so many times, financially and in every other way, all through her life. He lived in sort of very, very wealthy circles. After all, he was a member of the Rothschild clan, although he himself was not of the very, very wealthy. In fact, he had a sort of an agency that he ran. And this is in the exhibition. It's very funny. It's the first time that we see her doing erotic pictures. And this is this is John Rothschild, and this is the watercolors, which I think are very funny. The bathroom, he's peeing in the sink and she's peeing on the side. And the other one is really a very truthful one, because it's talking really about their relationship. It's called Alienation, and it's either before or after the sex act. And look at his red slippers, and he's turning on. She's not really expecting him with any great excitement. Now, these pictures, of course, were not shown publicly, but he was terribly important, because this awful man, this awful Doolittle man, got so distressed about her work that she said he was on drugs. Whether this is true or not, we don't know, but he certainly was extraordinary. He destroyed, she says, something like well over 200 drawings, and he slashed all her paintings. And he came at her with a knife, and she fled. And she fled to John Rothschild, who put her up in a hotel and literally saved her life at this particular time. So we're talking about roughly 1934. Okay, next two. But she didn't in the end. He was married, and Rothschild was married. He left his wife and children and wanted to marry her, but she very, very resolutely decided that she would never marry again, and so she refused him. But then she had this moment of sheer passion. She, with John Rothschild, went to a nightclub, and they were, because he had plenty of money, and one of the things that she loved about him was that after literally having no money for a decent food or anything, occasionally he would take her to the Harvard hotel and all the famous hotels to have lunch, or dinner, and she liked that. They went to a nightclub, and she saw this young man, and she saw him play. He was playing a guitar. He was called Jose Negron, and you can see the picture she paints of him, which is very romantic. And this was painted in 1936. And so when she comes back, of course, she does come back to the house, to the flat she was living with this awful man, and they moved to Spanish Harlem. Now, this was an extraordinary thing for a middle-class white woman to do, but he was Puerto Rican. And at that particular time, that particular part of Spanish Harlem was completely full of Puerto Ricans. And this wonderful painting here on the left is Spanish Harlem in 1938. She moves there in 1938, and it's 107th Street. And she lived in Spanish Harlem, not in that same flat, for over 24 years. And it's so interesting, this one. You could actually see the street. There's they were sort of houses. She had eventually she had the second or third floor there in the street finally. But you can see the people here and right in the background. You really get a sense of the place. And she was besotted by him. he had a wife and children, and he left them for her, and he moved in with her, and they for a while, for a short while, about 2 years, they stayed together moderately comfortably. But this is his family, this is his brother, and this particular picture is called TB Harlem, and it's 1940. And it's his brother Carlos. And he actually had TB, and at the time they'd taken his ribs away, and this is what this is about. Now she said, it was said at the time, more people in Harlem died of TB than anywhere else in New York City. And so this picture is a complaint about the fact that they're not being looked after properly. On the right, it's called a Spanish family, but in fact, it's Carlos's wife, Margarita, and her children, or 3 of her children. He survives TB, and he lives until 1975, and so he does live through it. He goes on, and they have actually 5 children, and this is the 3 of them. But look at the face of the woman. You begin to get now the real sense of the despair of their literally financial conditions, because they were desperate to feed their children. This was the most terrible thing at the time, because we're talking about 1940, and the Spanish family actually is 1943, and it really is quite dreadful. Okay, let's have the next 2. Now, she has a child. She has her first child by Negro, but by now you see her little girl has been taken away from her, and she's in Cuba. She hasn't seen her since she was almost a small child, and she now has her first son. And this particular picture is incredibly brave for the period. It's about childbirth. This is exactly what it is. She has her first child by a Negro in 1939. And this particular picture, which is called Childbirth, is 1939. And it is about the situation. And it is about, I've never had children, but I believe it's extremely painful. And this is basically what this picture is all about. The picture on the right is, I don't know much about this woman. She's called Alenka, and this is 1936. But the reason I've put it on is because it's one of the really first, really powerful female portraits, of which we're going to see many when she moves later on. This is a very early one. Her colors, you see, is relatively dark, relatively brown, and I think the one of childbirth is quite remarkable. Look at the pain, look at the eyes, look at the huge breasts, extraordinary. Okay, next one. Now this is really very, very strange. Now this I'm going to talk about a lot, because her daughter, the one that her husband had taken back to Cuba, came to visit her. At this particular moment, she and her mother and her family rented a summer place in New Jersey. And this little girl came to see her when she was about 6 years old. And she stayed for 2 months. Since reading the biography, I've learned a bit more about this visit. The little girl was horrified by her mother. She found her mother very difficult. And actually, Alice had a sister who was much more respectable. And she was interested in clothes, and she could sew and so on. And the little girl was much happier with the sister, and this is Isabetta. And when she didn't stay very long with her mother. She went to see her to stay for the rest of the time with her aunt, and then she went back. She asked to go back to Cuba.
Oh,
And this painting was done after she left. Now, this is the second version of it, because the first version was destroyed by this dreadful man, Doolittle. And this is the second version. Now, it's an extraordinary picture of a very young girl. But why I've put these Cézanne on is at this particular moment, we're talking about 19, this particular is better. The second one, she did a second one after the first one was destroyed, and this is 1935, the first one was 1934. Now, at that time, the French sold this Cézanne to the Americans, and this particular Cézanne of the bather of 1885 was on show, great pleasure, at Philadelphia. And there's no doubt that she saw it. And I just would ask you to notice the difference, the way that she's used the same sort of stamps for her picture, this very, very strange picture of Isabetta. And right on the extreme right, it's more a picture of puberty of 1894, 95. I'm not sure whether or not she knew Munch. I think she probably did. But I think this particular picture is a very strange one of her daughter. And she now has, in 1930, 1940, she meets the man she calls the love of her life. And he is a very difficult person. He's called Sam Brodie. And he was born in 1907, so 7 years younger than her. And he died in 1985. He was, in fact, a photographer and a filmmaker. And he terribly, again, they're all member of the Communist Party, as all of these were. They were friends of all these things. And he actually started the left-wing filmmaking group called the Film League, and he was very much involved with it. But what he had an extremely bad, quick temper, had a very, very, very bad temper. And he used to get very, very anxiously angry all the time. There's a lovely photograph of them both in 1940. And she meets him in 1940. And what she doesn't know, of course, is that he's married and has children. He says that his wife has left, that he is divorced. He tells her lies about it. In fact, all through their relationship, he went back to his first wife in the afternoons very often, and he had goodness knows how many mistresses while they were together. They stayed together for a very long time, until 1958, on and off. He was a violent man, and he loathed Richard, the little boy. And the picture in the center, which is very frightening, is Sam and Richard in 1940, and it's oil and pastel. Look at the terrified child. Richard said later that he used to kick him under the table. He was absolutely terrified of him. And this is the one thing that I find very difficult to understand. They say that it's exactly like many, many people are when they're being in this kind of awful relationship. But for some reason or another, there's a terribly interesting man called Bonoski, who she meets, who simply cannot understand why she's staying with this ghastly man, because he literally used to beat her up as well as the other one. She finally has her second son with him, and he's called Hartley. At the time, he was called NEEL. He changed his name later to Hartley, literally, because NEEL was pretty well impossible. But the picture on the right is Sam and Hartley, and that's 4 years later. The middle one is 1940, and the one on the right is 1944. And this particular man and she stayed in this very strange relationship, which is very on and off for all that length of time. And he was very, 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 now the most awful thing happened. The little boy they finally discovered, or rather, to be honest, although the Sam was so terrible, it was this Sam who actually found that the doctor, the orthopedic, the man who was, I've forgotten what the word is for eyes. I suddenly can't remember what
optometrist?
The optometrist. This particular doctor was a German optometrist, and he discovered the real truth of what was wrong with Richard's eyes was a lack of vitamin A. He was put into hospital, and when he was born, he could see perfectly well. And within 6 months, his eyes began to go bad. And at one point, he could hardly see. We put him into hospital with the vitamin C. And finally, he could see, but very, very not well. I mean, he was always, his eyesight was always difficult. And this marvelous portrait of him sitting in a chair. Look at these huge eyes. This is what you see in all of the, this is Richard, age 5 in 1945. Now they moved, they're still in Spanish Harlem, but they actually moved to the place in which he was going to stay really for the next 25 years. And it was a sort of a very, very large flat, still in Spanish Harlem, but it was very large. It was over a railway, by the side of a railway. And what I've discovered since reading this biography, all the rooms sort of were connected to each other. It was like a sort of from the front room, then went straight into the bedroom, then straight into the kitchen. Oh, and it was quite dreadful.
It's called enfilade, in a file, in a line.
Anyway, this particular, it was the children, both the boys say that literally their bedroom was by the front door. And so, and she always had enormous numbers of people in the house. And there were lots and lots of friends. And they all night long, virtually, these people would come through the children's room. Now, the one on the left, which is the new house, really. And this is the fire escape at East 108th Street. Now, this particular picture is done in 1943, and the Richard, age 5, is 1945. The one on the right is little Hartley. This is Hartley 3 years younger, and this is Hartley on a rocking horse. Now, this is a very interesting picture because can you see in the background? It's the first time there's a self-portrait. She's painting herself, painting Hartley. And this, you see there, and this rocking horse, they found it in the street because they didn't have any money to buy things like this. And she repaired it. And there is the little boy. But look at the rather terrified look of this child. This is of course, Sam's son, whom was very fond. Hartley turned out to be the most sort of practical of the two boys. And he was the one who really sort of helped his brother Richard the whole time. Now, as I say, we're talking about absolutely no money, terrifyingly problem. This terrible Sam man who would occasionally, I think he'd give her $30 a month or something. Now, in 1946, something really quite dreadful happened. Her father died, and she did this incredible portrait of her father, the dead father of 1946. And there he is with the roses in his hand and the lilies behind, and this strange picture of her. And the picture on the right, is probably somebody wanting to come in. His picture on the right is my mother widowed of 1946. And this is the same year. And it's one of the most, she said her mother died 5 years later. Actually, she came to live with Alice. But she never really recovered from the death of her husband. And it's an extraordinary, what did she say?
Don't worry about it.
This is the most interesting of the two. Of here you've got a picture of her boys. He was quite remarkable because she somehow or another got these children into a little school, a little a children's school, and she herself taught in it, completely free. Now, this particular school eventually was associated with the Rudolf Steiner School. Now, this was a superbly educational establishment, because there's no doubt in the way that the Steiner schools were taught. They were taught the humanities and the maths and extremely good education. But of course, it was very expensive. But she managed to get full scholarship for these children, and both of them went. First of all, of course, Richard, because he was the elder, and then he was supported. He was followed, of course, by Hartley. And this particular picture of the two children is Hartley and Richard in 1950. But at the same time, remember, she's living in Spanish Harlem. And this wonderful painting here is two girls in Spanish Harlem of 1959. So it's 9 years later. She had, her pictures of children are quite remarkable. They're not at all cute in the sort of Mary Cassatt way of children's shoot. They really, she treated the children in the same way that she treated the people. She wanted to know about their spirit, what was making them. And these extremely grown-up pictures of these two little girls, these eyes looking at us directly, and as it is with her own children here. Okay, next two. Now these are some of the most extraordinary of her works. This one is Howard Cross, and he was 1950. He's an enormously important writer. He published The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual in 1967, and he was also associated with the theatre, and he started the Negro Theatre in Harlem, this particular one. But the man on the right is really important. He's called Philip Banofsky. Now, Philip Banofsky was a lifelong communist. All these people are, but he was the cultural leader, and he was the correspondence for the Daily Worker. He met Alice actually by a friend, and she asked him if he would sit for a portrait for her. He didn't know her, didn't particularly want to. We went to see her, and he saw this, what he said was an absolutely terrible situation, was this ghastly man, Sam, who appeared and disappeared and appeared and disappeared, and basically was terribly, terribly cruel to Richard. And Richard took a fancy to this man, and he really was very, very kind to Richard. He really became almost like a second father. He didn't have an affair with Alice, one of the few people that didn't really, but he was very, very, very much involved with the family. He was a writer, and what they discovered now, of course, he kept a diary, and there's something like 300 pages of this diary in which he describes the family, because it becomes very, very close. Because of his interest in Richard, he was very worried about Richard as was John Rothschild. John Rothschild was too frightened of the aggressive Sam to really do anything about it. But Bronowski really tried. Now here we have very interesting, again, politically interesting picture. This is the death of Mother Blood. Now Mother Blood was a woman communist who was extremely important for the children of the Harlem thing. And when she died, there was a public funeral in Harlem. And this is what is being painted by Alice of the public funeral. Here are all the people going all the way through it. Very, very interesting particular picture. But the man on the right is James Farmer. Now, James Farmer is really important. He's part of the New Deal. Do you remember the whole business of the problem? This is much later. This is 1964, and of course he was involved with the civil rights movement and the march from the South to Washington and from New York to Washington. And this particular picture describes the power of this man. If you see it, he absolutely fills his space completely. Powerful hands, tremendously strong hands. Look at the background of it, because it's her reference to the fashionable abstract expressionist, which was she actually was not shown literally at all for something like 20 years. She was shown earlier with when she was working with the WPA, but after that finished in 1943, she really didn't get an exhibition until 1950. I mean, she literally was in the dark, and she was working all the time. Okay, next one. This is one of the most interesting of her left-wing friends. He's called Art Shields, and he was the labor reporter of the Daily Worker. And his particular hero, he was interested in art, his particular hero was Van Gogh. And the reference to the yellow background is a reference to the Van Gogh self-portrait. He admired Van Gogh because he painted the ordinary people. But in the center, I couldn't resist telling you this, by this time, she's being picked up by the FBI. And this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they came to visit her. And the story is, her son said, the funny thing, these two men came to visit her. And it says the subject resides at 21 East 108th Street. She's self-employed as an artist at her home, a reliable communist and associated with a number of communists. She is reported to have painted portraits of several individuals who were communists. Another reliable informant advised that in 1951, the subject became engaged in the political discussion at an art gallery. At that time, she expressed pro-Soviet views. Reliable information advised that the subject and husband, Sam Brody, are communist members. As of 1948, their apartment was reported to be the main storage space for communist literature in Harlem, New York area. This investigation is predicated upon information service, didn't tell you it is, known for reliability, who advised that the subject was sympathetic to the Communist Party and painted pictures of communists. But they decided that she really wasn't dangerous. But they came to visit her, and it appears, her son said, when the two men came, she asked them if they would sit for portraits, and they refused very naturally. She paid no attention to this at all. Now, the picture on the right is very important. This is her painting of Dory Ashton. Now, Dory Ashton, you will all remember, is a very, very important art historian, art critic. And she was a great supporter of abstract expressionism. She, in fact, wrote many, many books about Rothko. Rothko was her great favorite. She died in 2010. Go back again just a minute, because I want to point out something. Notice the background. This is her reference to abstract expressionism at the back of this very, very almost two-dimensional portrait of Dory Ashton. Now, what we're beginning to see now is a real, she's getting to be involved, of course, with her neighbors. And this, all the time, she's with the people that surround her. And this particular young man, she was tremendously fond of. He was called Georgie A-R-C-E. I think it was AC, they called it RC, I'm not quite sure. The one on the left is 1953, and the one on the right is 1955. And this little boy was a leader of a gang and eventually noticed the knife in his hand. Eventually, he commits murder and he's in prison. And all the time that he's in prison, he's writing, they write to each other, she writes to him all the time. Who's that?
It's Jeff Losley.
Now, this picture is in the exhibition. Okay, next two. This is quite remarkable because these are Dominican boys, and they're on 108th Street, and this is 1955. Look at this carefully, and you really do see here. You see the whole street. You see the corner shop and the people on the other side of the road sitting on the stoops, and look at these children. But her time is beginning to come, because on the right, she's picked up by the Beatnik group, and she's actually in a cult film of 1959, which even I remember the name of. It was called Pull My Daisy. And here is Roland Park and, of course, Allen Ginsberg, and a photograph of her. And she becomes a part of this particular group of under the sort of the new avant-garde. Okay, next two.
Do you want to get some water?
Oh yes, my voice is going a bit funny. Now, thank God, at last, she gets rid of this terrible Sam Brodie. And this is the portrait, actually painted as they split, finally in 1958. They remain friends for the rest of life. Now, she's having a really bad time mentally. And eventually, John Rothschild manages to persuade her to take mental, to go to a psychiatrist, and she does. And the psychiatrist talks to her, and he says to her, you're not promoting, because she hasn't had any exhibitions, you're not promoting yourself properly. You really must start trying. And so she tries, and very, very, very nervously, she sends a letter to Frank O'Hara in 1960. And he at the time is a curator at MoMA, and he's having an exhibition of figurative art. And she asks him to come and sit for her. She paints him twice, actually, but he never showed her, and he never wrote about her. And this particular portrait is 1960. Now, the one on the right is even more surprising. This is her portrait of Robert Smithson. Now, you will remember that Robert Smithson is the spiral jetty man in 1970. But at that time, he was a painter, and he was living in the city with her. And this is 1962. And it is an extraordinary picture because he had some sort of alopecia on his face, and you can see the reality of this on the picture. It's an amazing painting, this one.
I think he had severe acne.
Acne or something like
that. Scars for the rest of his life because he wore glasses.
Yes, he was. But it's an extraordinary painting, this one. And it's one of the last paintings she did in Spanish Harlem, because at this time she moved finally to where she finally, because now, the interesting thing that has happened in her private life is that because of her, the extraordinary Steiner School, she managed to, the Steiner School had a sort of another place, which was in New Hampshire. And she managed to get her boys into there. This was a boarding school. So at least for Richard didn't have the problem with Sam as he was having all the time. And all get completely free. She managed to get, because she had absolutely no money. And so eventually they went on to Columbia, and she moved from then, she moved finally to the area which was really very close to the Colombian area. So it was, she moved there, and this is where she stayed for the rest of her life. And these paintings here are two pictures of, it was full scholarships, of course. And there was the other school was called the Mowing School, and it was in New Hampshire, and it was founded in 1942, and it was a private coeducational case. Both the boys went there eventually. And of course, they gave them tremendous. The interesting thing, of course, both the boys said they never want anything to do with the kind of life his mother left, and they became very, very sort of bourgeois, like the gentlemen, both of these kids. And she moved now to this particular, where she's going to stay for the rest of her life. And the particular picture, yes, the particular picture is Mother and Child of 1962. And she moves to 300 West 107th Street apartment near Columbia College, where both her boys lived, went. In 1964, Richard graduated from Columbia, and Richard went on to do a BA at Tufts. Here we have the Mother and Child of 1962, and she was a neighbor. And the other one is lovely. He's called Abdul Rahman, and this is 1964. He was a taxi driver, but he self-described himself as a Black Muslim. And this is sort of a powerful picture. Now, the next one is going to be tremendous. Now you see how she's becoming very much up to date, because what is happening in 1964, of course, the American started the Vietnam War. And this particular picture is the first time she exhibits, when she finally exhibits an unfinished board. What is regarded as an unfinished picture. And it's called The Black Draftee. And he's called James Hunter. And this is 1965. And he is being called up for the Vietnam War. And he sits for her long enough to do the portrait of the head. But then he has to go to Vietnam. And so this picture is really very important, because it's about the poor man, poor Black man, who the Americans on the whole had very little interest, but they were useful to fight this particular war. And he was sent off to Vietnam. And as far as I know, he didn't come back. The one on the right is very interesting. This particular picture is called the Fuller Brush Salesman. But when we look at it, look at his hand, look at himself, but when we really understand the sort of man he was really called Devald Straub. And he actually had escaped. He was Jewish, and he'd been put into Dachau. And when he escaped, and he came to America in 1939, and he went into the Second World War. He was a soldier in the Second World War, And that's on the side. And this particular picture is one of the most marvelous ones. This is 1965. Now she's being picked up by as I say, the underground. And this is her painting, which is very surreal, of Allen Ginsberg, and it's 1966. She calls it a memory picture. I think it's about drugs. I think that she doesn't take drugs, but of course he was. And that extraordinary is presumably one of his sort of mental experiences when under the conditions, I imagine. And the other one is one of her really ironic pictures. This is called The Great Society. And it's 1965. Look at those people. Look at the people, sort of the sad, homeless, poor people. Okay, next one. Now this is something really fascinating. This girl here is the Marxist girl, and she's called Irene Peshkin, and it's 1972. Look, she's in control of herself. Look at, she's a very strong figure. And the two on the other one are the Wellesley girls of 1967. And these, again, are very ironic because when she's describing her time at the female art school in Philadelphia, she was absolutely despised. All the students, because they were young, rich young girls who came before they actually got married. She had no time. Now, the Wellesley School is a very, very, very expensive girls' college. And I think, was it, somebody said that it is one of the ones, you know, of the female colleges of the time. And this particular one is about it.
It is a women's college.
Women's college, yes.
It's mostly like middle.
It's a very expensive one, isn't it? Now she's picked up in 1968. There's a big exhibition at Graham Gallery, and her work is shown for the first time. And she's picked up by a feminist art historian called Cindy Nebza, who writes about her. And gradually people are beginning to come and talk about her. Now, this is a very interesting series because this is looking out of the window of her new flat, which she's going to stay with the rest of her life. And this is 109th Broadway, and this is 1976. But fascinatingly, these are the pictures of her two boys. In the center, you've got Richard. Presumably, his eyes are better, and he's studying for his finals, and he's stressful. And the other one is Hartley, 1976. So we've got 63 and 76. And the boys at that time, they both go to Columbia to start with. One is medicine, one takes medicine, and the other one takes law. And they both do very well. Okay, next one, because this is a very important one. This lady is called Muriel Gardner. And Muriel Gardner and Bullfinger, and this is 1966. Now, lovely John Rothschild has finally come through. He used to send all sorts of people to her to get portraits, but this lady is very important. She's a very, very wealthy psychologist. And she gives her an allowance. She's a psychiatrist friend of Rothschild. And from 1964, she provides a lifelong stipend of $6,000 a year, which now would be something like 60,000 probably by her terms. And so suddenly for the very, very, very first time, she's comfortable. She has enough money. And this is a portrait of this lady. And the one on the right is mother and child. And this is Nancy and Olivia. Now, Nancy is Richard's first wife. And this is her first grandchild. And Nancy becomes very, very close to both her granddaughter, her step daughters-in-law. Sorry, I get it right. And they say she always paints her first grandchild, and this is her first grandchild. This is 1967, so it's a year after the other one. Now, this is a very interesting one because suddenly she is again through the fact that people are beginning to know her. She meets Henry Getzauer. Now, he is very important. She hopes that he's putting a big exhibition on because he's the first modern curator for the Met. He was born in 1935 and he died in 1994. And she painted him in 1967. And what are we seeing on the right? We see the Hockley painting of the same man, Henry Getzauer, and Christopher Scott, his boyfriend. But this time, it's 1968, it's a year later, 69. There's a detail of the head, which is from this one, but there's a drawing up there at the top of 67. This is Hockley, and this is, of course, he doesn't show her or talk about her at all. So it's all hopeless, really. But interestingly, she travels for the first time in 1969 to the Soviet Union with Rothschild, and then after that, she goes to Mexico. She's never before, she doesn't go abroad until this particular period when she goes with Hartley. And but in 1970, she's included for the first time in the Whitney Annual. And mostly because of Sidney Netzer she's a feminist art historian, and she asked the Time magazine to help. And this particular series is going to start a series of pictures, again, completely never done before, of pregnant women. And this exhibition, this is Pregnant June and Algiers in 1967. Now, this is actually painted these people lived in San Francisco, and they were friends of Richard's. Richard, by now, had taken medical degree, and he was working in a hospital down there. And the man is a chemistry student, and they become friends. But the interesting one is the family. This is 1967, and this is a year later. This is the family. It's Aldous, Julia, and Bailey of 1968. Tiny little figure of the woman and the dominant man, the child. I think this is very interesting. It tells us all about them, really. But they stayed together. They're friends for years and years. And it's when he's in San Francisco that he meets the picture of the lady we've just seen before is going to be his wife. Now, meanwhile, suddenly, by the help of really the feminist women, she's becoming fashionable. And Andy Warhol comes and sits for her. It's the most extraordinary painting, because you know how Andy Warhol was always the dominant figure in all of his things. The reason I put the picture on the right, it's later self-portrait photograph of Andy Warhol. But here we see her vulnerable for the first time. And he was shot by Valerie Solanas in 1988. This is 1960, 1968. And you see he hits a scar.
When was he shot?
68, I think. And this is 1970. And you can see the scar. and round the corset round him. But look at that vulnerable. It's not unfinished. She didn't want it. It's as if it's telling you about his life.
So she purposely left it like
Purposely left it because to get this sort of unfinished state. And the gentleman on the left is the reason actually that this picture is painted, because he was called Gerard Berlanga, and she'd met him, and he was an assistant to Warhol, possibly Warhol. Warhol by this time had started this extraordinary group, and he was, of course, abstract expressionism had gone, and now it was pop art. And Berlanga was in fact part of the Velvet Underground, this extraordinary musical thing that Warhol did, and he was a dancer. And it was he who persuaded Warhol to come to sit with Alice Neil, and it's the most amazing one. But now suddenly, Time magazine become interested in her, and this particular girl is very, very important because she's called. This particular picture was commissioned by Time, and it's Kate Millett, and she was a radical feminist, and she'd written this very famous book about sexual politics. And here is the Time copy of the Time magazine, and here is Neil's painting of it, but she painted it from the photograph because she wouldn't pose for him. But suddenly she's picked up by the real curious avant-garde people. And in 1970, interestingly, John Rothschild, who's been dying to marry her all this time, but she will not marry him. He moves in her flat, and he stays there until he dies, which is 75. He dies at 75. But this particular picture is Geoffrey, Henrik, and Brian of 1978. And the Henrik is the major figure, and he's this one, and this is Brian sitting here. And here you get her beginning sense of gay people and transsexual people. Okay, the next two. This is so funny, this one. This particular one is the picture on the left. Can we have the other one back? Because I forgot to say this. Now, this particular pair are going to stay together for the whole of their lives. And you can see the companionship. Look at the hands, look at the way the movement is. The next one, which is on this one, of course, this is a sort of one-night stand thing. This is David Bourdin and Gregory Batter. This is Gregory Batter. And of course, this is only a transient relationship. Now, the one on the right is Stephen Shepard in 1978. This is 1970. This is 1978. And we're now getting to the stage when we're not quite sure. Can we have that on the back a bit in a minute? We're not quite sure whether he's gay or not. He's ambiguous. This is an ambiguous. And then we see to the next one. And this is absolutely amazing. This is Jackie Curtis. Now, Jackie Curtis is working with the underground in the nightclubs. She's a singer and dancer and God knows what. He, and passionate to be a celebrity, will do anything. And this particular one is Jackie Curtis and her partner, a brief partner, Rita Red. And look at the way she's pushing this figure to Jackie Curtis is pushing the foot of the other one back. And she is the dominant figure of the two. And the one on the right is Jackie Curtis as a boy. And we are now looking at, and in 1971, in Philadelphia, the school that she went to, which was is now the School of Design. It's now called Moore College. And they award her with an honorary doctorate. So suddenly she's becoming famous and fashionable. Okay, next one. This is absolutely extraordinary. I find this difficult to deal with. She is again one of these sort of dancers, and she's called Annie
Sprinkles.
Sprinkle, and it's 1982. And she's again, she's a very, very strong feminist, and she is particularly going on about the joys of sex, and this terrible costume she's wearing is what she performs in. The figure on the top is much earlier. He's a ballet dancer of the 1950s, and I've put a Warhol Marilyn Monroe onto it too, which is 1964, simply because this particular Annie Sprinkler is the wig and so on is meant to be sort of faintly like Marilyn.
Didn't she have like ravens, like a raven or some bird on her
Oh,
head?
exactly, it's the bird on her head. Yes. Extraordinary. But look at her. One doesn't really want to say, but look at this from her vagina, this thing hanging down.
Yes, she has a piercing.
Piercing, yes. Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, extraordinary, this one. Okay, next one. This is so interesting. Here we've got Ginny. And Ginny is going to be this is the very this is Nancy. This is Nancy Richards' wife. And this one, Ginny, is Hartley's wife. And this is Ginny in a striped shirt in 1969. And she marries Hartley the next year. And she says later that it's the 1970s and she's wearing a sort of tiny skirt and it's a very, very dominant female. But this one is very interesting. This is when she's interested in pregnant women. And this is literally 1 week before the birth of Olivia. This is 1971. And in the background is a painting of Richard in the background. Okay, next to. This one is much earlier. I've put those deliberately to show you the difference in her style, because the one on the left is her very, very great friend, the man, the reason that she actually met this really rather terrible sailor. She's called Nadja. This is Nadja New, and she's called Nadja Olenova. And she was a very, very great friend. This is 1933. And Margaret Evans, pregnant, is 1978. Now look at this, look at in the mirror, in the background in the mirror. And look at her face. The sense, nobody's ever painted these pregnant women before. And the point about it, look at her face. It's half frightened, half expectant. It's exactly, and look at the breasts. She makes no bones about it. This is what happens to a woman's body when she's just at the point of pregnancy. This lady is not pregnant. Okay, next one. This, I think, is absolutely splendid. This actually is Nancy with her twins of 5 months. And this is 1971. Alexandra and Angelina, the 2 girls. And on the right, it's Ginny, the daughter-in-law of Hartley. And this is 1976. And this is Elizabeth. And look at the way she's described, the watchfulness of the mother. Now, the interesting thing about these women, these 2 girls, and the sense of pregnancy, it's her own attitude to children. Later on, she she adores her, she loves her sons, but she says if she's not painting, she really is completely, she feels that she has great depressions if she's not painting, and she feels the only time she's really alive is when she's painting. And she resents the time that it takes for her to look after the children. And later on, the children say, although they both adore her, that she used to leave them alone sometimes when there was something like 3 and 5. And goodness knows what would have happened to the kids now. But she's really questioning this sense of the way that a woman's life is completely separated by her need for motherhood and her what in her case, the painting. Okay, next one. This is her only grandson. And this is very, very funny. This is Andrew in 1972. It's the second child of Hartley and Ginny. It's the only grand. The reason I've put the one in the middle, it is in fact Hartley and Andrew NEEL in 1983. So this is the baby in 1972, and this is the little boy in 1983 with his father. And the one on the right, the little girl, we saw the pregnant mother. This is Olivia in the red hat, which I think is absolutely lovely. This is 1974. This was painted not by the seaside. This was painted in the house. Okay, next to this, though, is one of the most poignant. This woman this is Carmen and Judy of 1972. Now, Carmen was the cleaning woman for her daughter-in-law, and she just had this little girl, and the little girl died almost immediately. You see, she can't really find. She was born. Stillborn, and she died soon after this. She can't really find the breast. It's one of the most wonderful ones. Of course, she identified tremendously with this lady because of her loss of her own children. The other ones are the DeVee twins. This is 1975, and the other one is 1972. But basically, I put these together to show the difference between the poor coloured woman and the really wealthy children, because they're actually the twins of a gallery owner who had a sort of a gallery and a small art school in New Jersey, and she showed with him. And she did these pictures of it was near the summer house where she spent in New Jersey. And this is 1975. This is the twins. Okay, next to. This is so extraordinary and it's so funny. This is a very funny story. This gentleman was a critic and a curator, and he was curating an exhibition of male nudes. And he came to her to ask to borrow that terrible one of the gold man that we saw with all the extraordinary picture we saw of 1933. And so she said firmly, I'll lend it to you if you'll pose for me nude. And he said later, it was the most ridiculous thing, because what you have to remember, she never had a studio. She always worked simply to begin with. She didn't have the money for it. She worked in our house, and people used to have to come past the children when they had to sit for her. And he says later on, it was the most extraordinary experience, because he was posing while her daughter Nancy was walking backwards and forwards into the place. It's a marvel. Of course, it's absolutely a take on the women odalisques that have always been painted by men. This is a female painting a male odalisque. I think it's very funny. He's called John Perrault, and it's 1972. And he was a curator, as I say, of the Met. And it is an extraordinary one, really, this one. And there's Joe Gould that he was wanting to do. Now, this gentleman is a Japanese, and he's a designer, and he designed for Vogue, and he was the design editor for Vogue, and he also did lots of work for the theatre, and it's 1971, and it's really a very beautiful one. This particular picture is a good one. It's one that it's from the real thing. Camilla took this photograph, and when we went to look at it, it's a lovely painting, this one, tremendously elegant. Now, these are extraordinary. This is Cindy Mensa. She's the woman really that started the rediscovery of Alice Neil. And she came to have her portrait painted. And Alice Neil said, take your clothes off. She wanted to paint her nude. And so she said, very embarrassedly, they took their clothes off, and this is she and her husband. And it's painted in 1975. And she was this very, very important feminist curator who really fought to have Alice Neil's work shown. And in 1974, everything changes because of Nemtsa, she gets this big retrospective at the Whitney, and suddenly everybody sees her for the first time. And this is Linda Nochlin. Linda Nochlin is possibly one of the greatest of the art historians of the time. And this is Linda Nochlin and Daisy. And as pointed out, that incidentally, all of you, when you get back, please look on the computer, on the television, and just ask for Alice Neil. With any luck, you actually hear her speaking. But this is wonderful. This is, I got from one of those. They point out that the two hands, the hands of the little girl and the hands of the mother, and she's sort of moving about, and the mother is holding her down. It's one of the most lovely ones. This particular one is 1973. And as I say, in 74, she has this great exhibition.
One of the things that we noticed in the exhibition were, again, you
Well,
mentioned the hands earlier.
Always, yes.
That the way that these two are touching,
Yes.
it's almost like they make a ring, almost like
It is. It's very beautiful, isn't it?
It's really lovely.
Because they were terribly embarrassed by it, so she says later on. They didn't want to post nude at
But
all.
there were a couple of videos that are worth watching in the exhibition, and the sitters always
Fabulous,
point out that she would talk to them
All
for
the time,
hours.
yes.
I mean, they would talk to each other for hours, so it was always like really
She always
comfortable.
said, interestingly, she said later on, very interestingly, when they left, she felt sometimes that she'd completely emptied. Yeah. She'd given herself completely to these people. Okay, next one.
And to making the
absolute portrait. This is Don Perlis and Jonathan. This is 1982. Now, this is very interesting because it is right in the middle of feminism. And she is actually here. This particular child was born with cerebral palsy, and his wife was working, and he became the carer in the family home. And look at the way the child is touching his father's face. It's a very touching picture, this one, I think. And of course, the child is ill. And this is 1982. But the one on the right is very funny. This is Richard, successful, very successful lawyer. And it is called In the Era of the Corporation, 1978-79. She doesn't approve of the way that both of her children, her boys, have literally joined the bourgeois. They have wanted nothing to do with the way of life that they'd been brought up with. And I think this is a charming picture of this. And it really is quite remarkable, I think. She thoroughly disproves of capitalism. Okay, next one. This is a funny one because this is a woman, art historian. She's called Mary Gallard. And of this she said, while sitting, she carried on a constant monologue. I got terribly involved. So when she went, I felt empty, she says of this picture. And she was wearing this rather splendid hat. So she put her in. Look how she's firmly in charge. Now, the one on the right is very, very important. Very important to people like me because this Mayor Shapiro. Now, Mayor Shapiro was one of the greatest art historians of all time. He was a Marxist. and his art history is from the Marxist point of view. He masses and masses of books. He's a very prolific writer. He's a trustee of the Jewish Museum, and this is from the Jewish Museum. And he's very, very old. She paints him actually twice. She paints him as a young man in 1947, which I couldn't find. And this one is 1983. And in fact, he dies almost a couple of years afterwards. Now we're really coming to the end of her life. Okay, next to this incredible self-portrait. She was 80 and she painted it in 1980. She said it took her 5 years. And this is Camilla's photograph. So this is the right color. And this is the one I got from the book. And this particular picture, she's actually not telling the exact truth because she's putting the brush in her right hand. In fact, she was left-handed. So she always painted with her left hand. You see this in the pictures of her. She said that she didn't do a self-portrait until she was no longer vain. And here you see the picture of the sagging, never done before, the sagging body of an older woman. Look at the breast, the tummy, the feet, the hair. And on the right, John Rothschild, the same year. Remember the young man we saw? He's living with her. They're not there, and he, in fact, will die in her flat. She will die in 1984. Next one. And here we have this lovely photograph of Alice Neil as the guest of Johnny Carson in The Tonight Show of 1984. She dies in her New York flat with her family. She dies of cancer with her family around her. And she really is, there's no question about it. She was, the Times called her in the review after she died, the quintessential bohemian. And she took her family, she was the first living artist to have American artist to have an exhibition in the Soviet Union. And she had a big one in 1981, and she took her family, her boys and her grandchildren with her. And she said she had come by that time, not to be, when she saw what the Soviet was really like, she lost her enthusiasm, I think, for communism, but she stayed to the end. And when you see her on that, I hope you will, on the computer, you will find that she always refers to herself as a humanist and a left-wing figure, but this is not something that is pushed by the American view. Okay, I think that's it.